Stay with me on this one because what I'm about to show you affects something you touch dozens of times every day without ever thinking about it. That device in your pocket, the one you use to check messages, scroll through videos, navigate to work, pay for coffee, that smartphone contains materials that come overwhelmingly from one country, and that country just announced it's prepared to cut off supply. This isn't speculation. This isn't fear-mongering. This is a statement made by government officials backed by export restrictions already being implemented, targeting the exact materials that make your phone, your laptop, your electric vehicle, and your country's entire defense infrastructure possible. The country is China. The materials are rare earth elements, and the threat is real. Most people have never heard of rare earths. They assume the components in their smartphones come from factories in various countries, assembled through some complicated but ultimately reliable global supply chain. The reality is far more concentrated and far more precarious than anyone wants to admit. Rare earth elements are 17 metallic elements with unique magnetic, luminescent, and electrochemical properties that make modern technology possible. Without them, your smartphone screen doesn't work. The speakers produce no sound. The vibration motor sits silent. The camera cannot focus. These aren't optional features powered by rare earths. These are fundamental components that cannot function without materials that China controls. Let me give you numbers that should make you deeply uncomfortable. China produces approximately 70% of the world's rare earth elements. That alone would be concerning. But production is only part of the story. When it comes to processing and refining, transforming raw ore into the materials that actually go into technology, China controls nearly 90% of global capacity. This means that even rare earths mined in Australia, the United States, or Africa almost always flow to Chinese facilities for processing. The entire global supply chain funnels through one nation, and that nation has just made clear it's willing to use that control as a weapon. In early 2025, following escalating trade tensions with the United States, China announced export restrictions on 7 critical rare earth elements. This wasn't a vague policy statement. This was a specific list targeting materials essential for defense applications, advanced electronics, and clean energy technology. Samarium, used in precision-guided missiles and satellite systems. Gadolinium, essential for nuclear reactors and medical imaging. Erbium, critical for fiber optic communications. Terbium and dysprosium, necessary for the permanent magnets in electric vehicle motors and wind turbines. These restrictions require export licenses that can be delayed, denied, or used as leverage in ongoing negotiations. The message from Beijing was unmistakable. You want to restrict our access to advanced semiconductors? You want to impose tariffs on our goods? Fine. Let's see how your technology sector functions without the materials only we can provide. This confrontation has been building for decades, but most people in the West have no idea how we got here. The story begins in 1992, when Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping made a statement that has since become legendary in strategic circles. He said, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." At the time, China was still a developing nation. The Cold War had just ended. America was the undisputed global superpower. Nobody took the comment seriously. Rare earths were obscure materials that most policymakers had never heard of. That dismissal may prove to be the greatest strategic blunder of the post-Cold War era. While Western nations celebrated the triumph of free markets and globalization, China executed a patient, methodical plan to dominate the entire rare earth supply chain. They began with mining, investing billions through state-owned enterprises to extract rare earths from deposits in Inner Mongolia and southern provinces. But the strategic genius wasn't in mining, it was in processing. Refining rare earth ore into usable materials is technically complex, capital-intensive, and environmentally devastating. It produces radioactive waste, toxic runoff, and requires massive amounts of chemicals. Western nations, facing environmental regulations and community opposition, gradually abandoned their own processing operations. It was cheaper and politically convenient to let China handle the dirty work. China didn't just accept this role, they weaponized it. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Chinese companies operated at deliberate losses, keeping rare earth prices so low that no Western competitor could survive. The Mountain Pass mine in California, once America's primary rare earth source, shut down because it couldn't compete with artificially cheap Chinese supply. Australian operations went bankrupt. European facilities closed. One by one, the alternatives disappeared, and China's market share grew from significant to overwhelming to near absolute. By 2010, China controlled 97% of global rare earth production. 97%. That's not market dominance. That's a monopoly achieved through strategic economic warfare, executed over decades while Western governments focused on other priorities. Then came the first demonstration of what this control actually meant. In 2010, a Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near disputed islands in the East China Sea. Japan detained the captain. China demanded his release. When Japan refused, Beijing did something that shocked the world. They cut off rare earth exports to Japan entirely. Japanese manufacturers dependent on these materials for their electronics and automotive industries faced an impossible choice: release the captain or watch production lines shut down across the country. Japan released the captain within weeks. The message was received globally, briefly. There were congressional hearings in Washington, reports were commissioned, concerns were expressed, and then, as so often happens, attention shifted elsewhere. The immediate crisis passed, prices stabilized, and China quietly continued consolidating control, now understanding exactly how powerful this leverage could be. What makes the current situation different, what makes it genuinely alarming, is that China is no longer being subtle about its intentions. The export restrictions announced in 2025 aren't emergency measures or diplomatic signals. They're the beginning of a systematic effort to use rare earth control as a tool of geopolitical power, and the West has no adequate response prepared. Consider what this means for the device you're holding right now. Every smartphone on the planet contains rare earth elements. The screen uses lanthanum and yttrium. The speakers and microphones use neodymium magnets. The vibration motor uses rare earth permanent magnets. The camera's autofocus mechanism depends on them. The glass itself is polished using cerium oxide. These aren't components that can be easily substituted. The unique properties of rare earth elements, their magnetic strength, their ability to produce specific colors of light, their thermal stability, are precisely why they're used. There are no drop-in replacements waiting in a laboratory somewhere. When China restricts these materials, there's no alternative supplier to call. Now multiply that dependency across every industry that matters. Electric vehicles require significantly more rare earth elements than conventional cars. The motors that drive Teslas, Rivians, and every other EV on the road use powerful neodymium iron boron magnets. A single electric vehicle can contain several kilograms of rare earth materials. The global push toward electrification, the transition away from fossil fuels that governments worldwide have committed to, depends entirely on materials that one country controls. Wind turbines face the same dependency. The direct drive generators in modern wind turbines use massive rare earth magnets, sometimes containing hundreds of kilograms of neodymium and dysprosium. The entire green energy transition runs through Chinese rare earth processing facilities. But it's the military implications that should truly alarm anyone paying attention. The F-35 fighter jet, the most advanced and expensive weapons program in human history, requires approximately 900 pounds of rare earth materials. Every guidance system in every precision-guided missile depends on rare earth magnets and electronics. Submarine propulsion systems, satellite communications, night vision equipment, radar systems. All of them require materials that China can restrict at will. The Department of Defense has published report after report warning about this vulnerability. Congressional hearings have featured testimony from generals explaining that American military readiness depends on supply chains controlled by a strategic adversary. And yet, despite years of warnings, no adequate solution has been implemented. Let me be specific about why alternatives don't exist. It's not that rare earth elements are geologically scarce. Despite the name, they're actually relatively abundant in the Earth's crust. Deposits exist in the United States, Australia, Canada, Brazil, India, and throughout Africa. The problem isn't finding rare earths, the problem is processing them. Turning raw rare earth ore into the separated, refined materials that actually go into technology requires sophisticated chemical processing that produces enormous amounts of toxic and radioactive waste. China built this processing capacity over decades, accepting environmental devastation that would be politically impossible in Western democracies. The tailings ponds in Inner Mongolia, the contaminated groundwater, the poisoned farmland around processing facilities. These are costs that China was willing to pay for strategic advantage. Western nations face a different calculation. Every proposed rare earth processing facility in the United States or Europe encounters immediate community opposition. Nobody wants radioactive waste stored near their homes. Environmental impact assessments take years. Permitting processes stretch across multiple administrations. And hanging over every investment decision is the knowledge that China can crash rare earth prices at any moment, making new facilities instantly unprofitable. This is the trap that Beijing constructed. They don't need to maintain their monopoly through superior efficiency or innovation. They maintain it by making the alternative economically and politically impossible. The numbers reveal the scale of the gap. In 2024, the United States produced approximately 43,000 metric tons of rare earth oxides. China produced over 210,000 metric tons. But production figures are almost irrelevant compared to processing capacity. America has essentially one significant rare earth processing facility. China has dozens, representing decades of accumulated expertise, specialized equipment, and trained workforce. Closing that gap isn't a matter of writing checks or passing legislation. It's a matter of time measured in decades, and we may not have decades. Some analysts point to recycling as a potential solution. Rare earths exist in discarded electronics, old hard drives, broken smartphones. Theoretically, these materials could be recovered and reprocessed. In practice, recycling currently provides less than 1% of rare earth supply. The technical challenges of separating rare earth elements from complex electronic waste are enormous. The economics don't work at current prices. And even optimistic projections suggest recycling could provide perhaps 10 to 15% of demand within a decade. That's not a solution. That's a rounding error compared to the scale of dependency. Others suggest that technological innovation will produce substitutes, alternative materials that can replace rare earth elements in critical applications. Research programs exist. Some progress has been made in specific applications. But the fundamental physics of rare earth elements, particularly their magnetic properties, cannot be easily replicated. Neodymium magnets are the strongest permanent magnets known to science. Reducing their use means accepting larger, heavier, less efficient motors and generators. In applications where weight and size matter, which includes virtually every advanced technology and weapons system, rare earth alternatives mean performance degradation. You can build an electric vehicle motor without rare earths. It will be bigger, heavier, and less powerful. You can build a fighter jet without rare earth components. It will be less maneuverable, less stealthy, and less effective. Meanwhile, China continues tightening its grip. The export restrictions announced in 2025 don't just limit raw materials. They restrict the export of processing technology itself. Even if another country wanted to build rare earth processing facilities, they would struggle to acquire the specialized equipment and expertise that China has monopolized. This is strategic encirclement, cutting off not just current supply, but the ability to develop alternative supply. And it's happening while Western policymakers debate, commission studies, and express concern without taking action commensurate with the threat. The European Union has published critical raw material strategies. Australia has tightened foreign investment rules. The United States has invoked the Defense Production Act for pilot programs. All of these responses share a common characteristic. They're reactive, fragmented, and operating on timelines that don't match the urgency of the situation. China spent 30 years building this position. Western responses measured in months or even years cannot possibly close the gap before it matters. So what happens next? What does China intend to do with this leverage they've so patiently constructed? The answer is already becoming visible, and it should concern everyone watching. The most immediate application is Taiwan. The island, sitting 100 miles off China's coast, produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. These chips power everything from smartphones to artificial intelligence to military systems. American security guarantees to Taiwan depend on the credible threat of military intervention if China attempts forcible reunification. But what happens to that threat when the weapon systems required for intervention depend on materials controlled by Beijing? Every F-35 that cannot be built because of rare earth restrictions is one less fighter jet available to defend Taiwan. Every guided missile that cannot be produced is one less threat to Chinese naval forces. Every submarine that cannot be maintained is a gap in the Pacific defense perimeter that adversaries will notice and exploit. This is the strategic checkmate China has been patiently constructing for 3 decades. They don't need to sink American ships or shoot down American planes to prevent intervention in Taiwan. They simply need to ensure those ships and planes cannot be built or maintained in the first place. The rare earth monopoly provides exactly that capability. And unlike military confrontation, which carries enormous risks and costs, supply chain leverage can be applied gradually, deniably, and with plausible economic justifications. Export licenses delayed for bureaucratic reasons, quality inspections that take months instead of days, processing capacity prioritized for domestic manufacturers while foreign orders wait indefinitely. None of these actions constitute acts of war. All of them degrade American military capability. But Taiwan is only the most obvious application of this leverage. Consider the broader technological competition between China and the West. Artificial intelligence requires advanced semiconductors, which require rare earth materials in their manufacturing equipment. Quantum computing depends on specialized components containing rare earths. Advanced telecommunications, including the 5G and future 6G networks that will form the backbone of digital economies, require rare earth elements throughout their infrastructure. Clean energy technology, from wind turbines to electric vehicles to energy storage systems, cannot function without these materials. The nation that controls rare earth supply has significant influence over who can compete in the industries that will define the 21st century economy. China isn't just securing supply for itself. It's positioning itself as the gatekeeper for everyone else. Want access to rare earths for your electric vehicle industry? Perhaps reconsider your position on Taiwan. Want reliable supply for your defense contractors? Maybe those semiconductor export controls should be loosened. Want processing capacity for your critical minerals? Consider joining the Belt and Road Initiative. This is how leverage works. It doesn't require dramatic confrontations or explicit threats. It simply requires dependency, and dependency is exactly what China has spent 30 years creating. The pattern is visible across developing nations where rare earth deposits exist. The Democratic Republic of Congo holds vast mineral wealth, including significant rare earth resources. Chinese companies now control approximately 80% of Congo's cobalt production. The infrastructure being built to extract these resources, the roads, railways, and port facilities, is largely Chinese financed and Chinese constructed. When these materials leave Congo, they flow to Chinese processing facilities. The same pattern repeats across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Anywhere significant deposits exist, Chinese capital arrives with offers that Western companies cannot match, state-backed investment that doesn't require immediate returns because the strategic value exceeds any short-term profit. So what can be done? The honest answer is that options narrow with each passing year, and the window for meaningful response is closing rapidly. The first option is accepting massive short-term costs for long-term independence. This would mean subsidizing domestic rare earth production regardless of market prices, essentially treating these materials the way previous generations treated strategic oil reserves. It would mean accepting environmental consequences that current regulations prohibit, fast-tracking processing facilities despite community opposition. It would mean maintaining these investments even when China inevitably crashes prices to make them unprofitable. This requires political will that Western democracies have rarely demonstrated outside of major wars. The second option is building alternative supply chains with allied nations. Australia has significant rare earth deposits and growing processing capability. Canada is developing projects. Japan has invested heavily in recycling and deep-sea mining research. A coordinated allied approach could potentially reduce dependency on Chinese sources over time. But coordination is difficult. Each nation has different interests, different timelines, and different tolerance for costs. And China has 30 years of head start that cannot be erased through summits and memoranda of understanding. The third option is technological substitution, developing alternative materials that can replace rare earths in critical applications. This is a long-term research challenge that offers no near-term relief. Even optimistic projections suggest meaningful substitutes are decades away for most applications, and during those decades, China maintains its leverage. The fourth option, the one that nobody wants to discuss openly, is accepting dependency and adjusting policy accordingly. This means recognizing that confrontation with China carries costs that may not be sustainable. It means understanding that the leverage Beijing holds constrains American options in ways that rhetoric cannot change. It means making accommodation with a rising power that controls the materials essential to modern civilization. This option is politically unpalatable, but may be strategically unavoidable if alternatives are not pursued with genuine urgency. Here's what I want you to understand. The device you're holding, the one you check dozens of times daily, is a physical manifestation of strategic choices made over decades. Choices to prioritize cheap consumer goods over supply chain security. Choices to let environmental costs be externalized to countries willing to accept them. Choices to assume that markets would always provide what technology requires. Those choices created the dependency that China is now prepared to exploit. The threat to cut supply isn't hypothetical. The export restrictions are already being implemented. The leverage is already being applied. And every day that passes without meaningful response is a day that alternatives become less viable and dependency becomes more permanent. This is not a crisis that will announce itself with dramatic headlines. It's a slow constriction, a gradual tightening of control that will constrain Western technological and military options for decades to come. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really happening behind the scenes, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to know why the technology they depend on every day is controlled by decisions made in Beijing. And in the comments, I'm genuinely curious. Do you think we've already passed the point of no return on rare earth dependency, or is there still time to build alternatives? Let me know what you think.